Trust is built on transparency, not appearances, and this truth becomes clearest in the quiet moments long before betrayal ever surfaces. In every relationship, whether between spouses, parents, and children, or even within one's own internal dialogue, trust isn't destroyed in the dramatic scenes people often imagine. It dissolves slowly, silently, through subtle choices, withheld truths, and emotional absences that at first seem too small to matter. Yet every small omission shapes a pattern, and every pattern creates a reality. Understanding this gradual erosion is essential if one wishes to understand why relationships collapse, why families fracture, and why people sometimes reach a breaking point without being able to fully explain how they got there. In the story, the betrayal appears sudden. A husband checking into a hotel with another woman, using his wife's name, and involving their son in the deceit. But the act itself is only the visible symptom of a deeper, far older problem. The real story doesn't begin at the hotel desk. It begins in the days, months, and even years before that moment, in the unseen spaces where transparency should have lived but didn't. This is the part most people overlook because it doesn't come with explosions or confessions or dramatic confrontations. It comes with small shifts in behavior, conversations that become shorter, explanations that feel vague, eyes that look away a second too long, and decisions made quietly instead of collectively. Transparency is not just about honesty. It is about presence. It is about letting someone see who you are, not only when things are smooth, but also when discomfort, fear, confusion, or dissatisfaction exist. But people often believe appearances are enough to maintain trust, the appearance of a functioning relationship, the appearance of a united family, the appearance of effort, respect, or commitment. They assume that as long as everything looks normal, everything must be normal. Yet trust does not feed on appearances, it starves under them. Trust requires clarity, and clarity cannot grow in shadows. In the family described, the emotional distance began long before the betrayal. The husband likely began adjusting his tone, withholding small details, avoiding conversations that once came naturally. These shifts often seem harmless at first. A missed call here, a vague explanation there, a tightened expression when asked a question that should have been easy to answer. But each small change teaches the other person something crucial, not about the truth, but about the distance between what is said and what is real. When emotional space widens, transparency becomes optional, and once transparency becomes optional, trust becomes fragile. As the emotional bonds weaken, people often start substituting transparency with performance. They display gestures of normalcy, behave in predictable routines, or offer half-truths wrapped in polite words. These performances are rarely malicious at the beginning. They are defensive. They are meant to prevent conflict, discomfort, or accountability. Yet every act of concealment, even a small one, becomes the foundation of bigger concealments later. Trust is not broken by the scale of a lie, but by the intention to hide in the first place. In this story, we may imagine the husband thinking he was protecting his wife by keeping certain truths from her. He might have convinced himself that she didn't need to know certain details, that they would only upset her, or that she would overreact. Perhaps he believed his actions were temporary, or that he would eventually correct course. Many people tell themselves these stories to avoid confronting the ethical weight of their own decisions. They distance themselves from the consequences by pretending the consequences are not real. But every time he chose secrecy, he withdrew a little more from the relationship. Every time he avoided openness, he trained himself and his son to believe that emotional honesty was unnecessary. This is where the educational lesson becomes important. Secrecy does not stay contained inside one action. It becomes a culture within the relationship. It shapes how communication happens. It influences how children learn to interpret loyalty, responsibility, and integrity. Children are especially sensitive to emotional patterns. They learn not only from explicit instructions, but from the silent language of behavior. If a parent behaves as though secrecy is normal, the child begins adopting that same worldview. If a parent uses manipulation or concealment to navigate relationships, the child internalizes the idea that honesty is optional. Before long, the child is not merely observing the secrecy, they are participating in it. This is exactly what happened in the story when the son helped his father with the hotel arrangement. A child does not naturally understand betrayal, but he understands loyalty. When loyalty is modeled in the wrong direction, a child can confuse loyalty to a person with loyalty to their wrongdoing. This confusion is not the child's fault, it is the result of the emotional environment created around him. The father's secrecy didn't just damage the marriage, it began shaping the moral compass of the next generation. And this is where the true erosion of trust becomes visible, when secrecy becomes normal to more than one person. Transparency, however, is not simply the opposite of secrecy. It is an intentional practice of emotional stewardship. It requires a person to confront truths about themselves, even when those truths are uncomfortable. It demands courage to speak honestly, especially when honesty risks conflict, vulnerability, or accountability. Transparency is the willingness to reveal one's inner world, not perfectly, not constantly, but consistently enough that trust has real substance to grow from. When people share their fears, frustrations, insecurities, and desires openly, they allow the relationship to breathe. Transparency gives the other person permission to exist in the relationship fully, instead of guessing, fearing, or compensating for what they don't know. In the story, the lack of transparency created an emotional fog in the marriage long before the infidelity occurred. It likely manifested in the wife as confusion, subtle feelings that something was off, conversations that didn't flow naturally, excuses that didn't quite add up. Many people sense emotional distance before they understand it, but often dismiss their intuition to maintain the peace. Unfortunately, dismissing intuition is one of the earliest ways trust begins to crumble internally. When a person cannot trust their own perceptions, they become more vulnerable to manipulation and more tolerant of unhealthy dynamics. This self-doubt is not weakness, it is a survival strategy in relationships where transparency is lacking. As secrecy grows, emotional fatigue grows too. One partner shoulders the weight of maintaining stability, harmony, and understanding, while the other partner avoids responsibility by hiding truth. Over time, this imbalance creates resentment, loneliness, and emotional exhaustion. Trust requires reciprocity. It is a shared responsibility. When one person carries all the emotional weight, they become the emotional parent of the relationship, while the other person behaves like an emotional child, avoiding reality. This imbalance makes genuine intimacy impossible because intimacy is built on shared emotional labor, not one-sided effort. When the betrayal finally becomes visible, like the moment the wife learned her husband used her name at the hotel, it does not actually shock the emotional memory of the relationship. It simply confirms what has been silently true for a long time. This is why, in many cases, the person who has been betrayed does not always erupt with the anger people expect. Sometimes they go quiet. Sometimes they become calm. Sometimes they simply breathe. Not because they don't feel hurt, but because they have already been living with the emotional symptoms of the betrayal long before the proof arrived. The act only reveals what their spirit has already suspected. Trust was eroding all along. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for emotional education. When trust is damaged, the visible betrayal is not the starting point, it is the final chapter of a long, unspoken story. The true beginning lies in the first moment someone stopped communicating openly, in the first moment someone felt unseen, or unheard, or unimportant. It begins in the moment someone decided to avoid discomfort instead of addressing it. It begins in the tiny cracks that appear when people stop asking questions and start assuming answers. Transparency stops these cracks from expanding. Secrecy widens them. When the wife discovered her husband's actions, her reaction reflected profound emotional maturity. She did not immediately seek revenge, confrontation, or dramatic declarations. She paused. She observed. She learned. This pause was not weakness, it was awareness. It was the ability to separate the emotional impulse from the emotional truth. She understood that breaking down would not rebuild trust, and exploding with anger would not restore clarity. Instead, she shifted her focus inward and toward her son, because she recognized that the real damage was not only in what her husband had done, but in what her son had learned from it. Her conversation with her son became the educational turning point of the story. She did not shame him or accuse him. She used the moment to teach him about responsibility, integrity, and the importance of aligning actions with values. This act of teaching, rather than reacting, restored a form of transparency in the only place where it still mattered, between mother and child. She showed him that trust is not rebuilt through punishment but through understanding. She taught him that appearances, no matter how convincing, cannot protect a person from the consequences of deception. And she helped him see that integrity is not defined by loyalty to another person's wrongdoing, but by loyalty to one's own principles. Her strength lay not in confronting her husband, but in confronting the emotional impact of secrecy itself. She reclaimed her own transparency by acknowledging how the situation made her feel, how it shaped her choices, and how it influenced her next steps. When she chose not to chase explanations from her husband, she demonstrated another profound truth. Explanations from someone who has been hiding rarely offer clarity. They offer excuses. They offer diluted versions of accountability. They offer stories designed to minimize guilt rather than reveal honesty. By refusing to engage in that cycle, she protected her emotional intelligence. In reclaiming her clarity, she restored trust within herself. And this is the part most people forget. Trust does not only exist between people, it exists within one's own inner landscape. A person must trust their instincts, values, dignity, and strength before they can meaningfully rebuild trust with anyone else. When transparency breaks externally, it must be rebuilt internally first. Ultimately, the story teaches that trust is not lost in one moment. It is lost in the accumulation of moments where transparency was withheld. It teaches that emotional distance is not harmless. It is a warning sign. It teaches that appearances can disguise dysfunction but cannot heal it. It teaches that silence can protect the wrong person and wound the right one. And it teaches that restoring trust begins not with demanding honesty from others, but with cultivating honesty within oneself. Trust is built on transparency, not appearances, because transparency allows people to see each other clearly, while appearances only allow people to imagine what might be true. When truth is visible, trust grows. When truth is hidden, trust decays. And when trust decays, even the strongest relationships eventually collapse, not from a single betrayal, but from the quiet erosion that began long before anyone noticed. If you want, I can now expand the second keynote or rewrite this in a more emotional, more dramatic, or more psychological style. Children learn their moral compass from the adult they follow, and this truth reveals itself most clearly in moments when their innocence intersects with adult behavior they do not yet fully understand. A child is not born with a complete sense of ethics, loyalty, boundaries, or responsibility. These qualities develop through observation far more than instruction. The world of a child is shaped not by the lessons spoken out loud, but by the actions silently absorbed. And when a child assists in wrongdoing, as in the story where a son unknowingly helps his father deceive his mother, it is rarely a sign of moral failure in the child. Instead, it demonstrates how deeply a dominant parent's behavior can sculpt a child's understanding of right and wrong long before that child has the emotional maturity to evaluate those actions critically. A child mirrors what they see. They imitate tone, body language, decision-making patterns, emotional reactions, and even the unspoken rules governing the household. If a child observes one parent consistently hiding things, manipulating narratives, or participating in deception, the child does not analyze these behaviors as unethical. They interpret them as normal. Children do not question the moral framework of the people they trust most. They adopt it. They assume that whatever a parent does must be acceptable simply because the parent did it. The son in the story did not assist his father out of rebellion or malice. He did so because he believed he was participating in loyalty, responsibility, and adult partnership. He believed he was being helpful, supportive, trustworthy. These beliefs were shaped by the father's influence, which likely presented secrecy as something clever, harmless, or necessary. If the father had regularly involved the child in private errands, secretive behaviors, or don't tell your mother dynamics, the child would internalize secrecy as a shared bond. What the father saw as convenience or manipulation, the child interpreted as closeness. The moral lines blur before the child ever realizes a line existed. Children who grow up observing duplicity learn to compartmentalize. They learn that truth is flexible and that honesty may depend on the audience. This is not an inherent flaw in the child, it is a learned strategy. When an adult models dishonesty as a survival technique, the child learns that deception is a tool, not a violation. Loyalty becomes weaponized, and a child learns to protect the wrong person simply because they believe that to protect someone is to love them. In the story, the son likely believed he was helping his father with something simple and harmless. He may have viewed it as an adventure, a grown-up responsibility, or a chance to gain approval. Children are naturally eager to please the adults they admire. They feel proud when entrusted with grown-up tasks, and when the dominant parent presents a morally questionable act as something normal or necessary, the child adopts that perception wholeheartedly. The child cannot differentiate between loyalty and complicity because no one has yet taught him the difference. He sees the world through the lens given to him by the parent who guides him. This dynamic highlights a crucial truth in child development. Moral values are formed through modeling long before they are formed through reasoning. Children do not understand ethics in abstract terms. They understand them through mimicry. They absorb cues about honesty, responsibility, and fairness not through lectures, but through lived examples. If a child sees that lying helps an adult avoid consequences, they subconsciously accept lying as a functional strategy. If they see secrecy rewarded, secrecy becomes a skill. If they see disrespect normalized, disrespect becomes permissible. Their sense of right and wrong becomes a reflection of the emotional environment created for them, not a natural instinct. In the case of the son who assisted his father at the hotel, his actions reveal much about the moral atmosphere he was exposed to. A child would not independently choose to participate in hurting a parent they love unless someone they trusted shaped the situation to appear harmless or justified. The father, knowingly or unknowingly, used his influence to reshape the child's moral thinking. A child cannot resist this influence. They do not possess the emotional or cognitive tools to challenge an adult's framing of a situation. And so, by participating in secrecy, the child was not expressing a lack of values, he was expressing loyalty to the parent who taught him what loyalty should look like. This is why the mother's reaction in the story becomes a pivotal educational moment. Instead of shaming the child or treating him as an accomplice, she recognized that his behavior was guided by imitation rather than intention. She understood that his moral compass had been shaped by the adult he followed most closely, not by malice. By approaching him with clarity, compassion, and accountability, she offered him something his father had not: moral direction grounded in integrity rather than secrecy. Her conversation with her son was likely the first time he was invited to reflect on the ethical weight of his actions. And this is where moral development truly begins, not in blame, but in awareness. She taught him that helping someone do wrong makes you part of the wrong, even if your intention was innocent. She taught him that loyalty should never demand silence in the face of injustice. She taught him that integrity sometimes means choosing discomfort over complicity. She taught him that love must align with truth, not with the avoidance of truth. Through this, she demonstrated a profound reality. One moral lesson delivered at the right moment can reshape a child's entire internal compass. Children learn by watching long before they learn by thinking, but they also learn by feeling. When a child feels the weight of their actions in an emotionally safe environment, they begin to understand ethics not as rules but as responsibilities. They begin to see that their choices have consequences, not only on others but also on the kind of person they are becoming. The father, in contrast, modeled the opposite lesson. He taught his son that deception is acceptable if it serves one's personal desires. He taught him that using another person's identity for personal gain is a strategy, not a violation. He taught him that concealment is easier than communication, and that loyalty means aligning with secrecy instead of truth. These teachings are dangerous not because they immediately corrupt a child, but because they normalize behaviors that the child will later struggle to unlearn. Children raised in environments where deception is normalized often enter adulthood with distorted understandings of trust. They may struggle with boundaries because they learn that boundaries are obstacles to be navigated rather than respected. They may struggle with accountability because they were taught that mistakes should be hidden rather than discussed. They may struggle with relationships because they learned loyalty based on fear, secrecy, or emotional manipulation, rather than mutual respect. This story also shows how powerful a single adult's influence can be in reversing that damage. The mother's calm, educational approach did more than correct her son's behavior. It offered a new model of integrity. Through her response, she showed him that truth can be confronting, but also healing. She showed him that love is not measured by how well one protects a person's wrongdoing, but by how well one protects one's own character. She showed him that standing for what is right may feel uncomfortable, but it defines the person he becomes. In this sense, the story becomes a lesson in the generational transmission of values. Every family passes down emotional patterns, some consciously, most unconsciously. Children inherit not only the language spoken at home, but the emotional grammar behind it. They inherit not only habits but worldviews. When one parent models harmful behavior, the child inherits the confusion. But when the other parent models healing, the child inherits the clarity. This is why the mother's intervention holds such educational power. She interrupted the cycle. She created a moment where values could be redefined, where the child could learn that morality is not dependent on imitation, but on reflection. She helped him distinguish between influence and integrity. She allowed him to question the behavior he previously accepted as normal. This shift is the foundation of moral awakening. It transforms a child from a follower of actions into a thinker of principles. Children who grow up learning integrity from at least one stable, emotionally intelligent adult often develop resilience against the moral distortions of the other parent. They learn that they have a choice. They develop emotional autonomy. They recognize that adults are not infallible. They understand that values must be examined, not inherited blindly. And most importantly, they develop a moral compass rooted in empathy, responsibility, and truth, rather than fear, manipulation, or loyalty to dysfunction. The son in the story, through his mother's guidance, is given a chance to realign his moral compass. Instead of absorbing the secrecy modeled by his father, he learns to understand the consequences of secrecy. Instead of enabling wrongdoing, he learns how to identify it. Instead of feeling pride in assisting deception, he begins to feel awareness of boundaries. This transformation is not instant, but it begins with one lesson delivered with clarity and compassion. Over time, these lessons build a stronger ethical foundation than the distorted values he absorbed earlier. This entire scenario also highlights the role of emotional dominance in families. The dominant parent is not always the most caring or the most present. Sometimes they are the one who controls the narrative, sets the tone, or exerts emotional pressure. Children gravitate toward the person whose approval feels harder to earn. If the father in the story projected authority, charm, or control, the child may have followed him out of a desire to feel important. This does not mean the child loved the mother any less. It simply means he was responding to the emotional power dynamics within the household. Children often choose the parent who appears to need them more, or whose emotional presence demands more obedience or admiration. This dynamic makes them vulnerable to internalizing behaviors without questioning their ethical implications. Understanding this helps us see why the mother does not blame the child. She recognizes that influence, especially from a dominant parent, can override a developing conscience. She understands that the child was not acting out of defiance, but out of misplaced loyalty. She sees that the moral confusion is a reflection of the environment, not the child's true character. And by responding with guidance instead of accusation, she helps the child reconnect with his innate goodness. Children are naturally inclined toward honesty, fairness, and empathy. These are baseline human traits. What distorts these qualities is the behavior children observe in their immediate environment. When deception is practiced by adults, children adopt deception. When integrity is practiced by adults, children adopt integrity. The child's moral compass is not broken, it is shaped. And it can be reshaped when exposed to healthier emotional models. The story, therefore, becomes a profound reminder that adults hold immense responsibility in shaping the ethical awareness of the next generation. Every choice, every secret, every truth told or withheld, every conflict addressed or avoided, every act of empathy or betrayal silently educates a child. Children watch. They absorb. They internalize. They replicate. And long before they understand morality intellectually, they practice it behaviorally. This is why the mother's role becomes a critical turning point. She becomes the corrective force. She becomes the moral anchor. She becomes the model of honesty the child can eventually lean toward. She does not erase the influence of the father instantly, but she introduces an alternative, a healthier, more stable emotional model the child can grow into over time. In conclusion, when a child assists wrongdoing, it does not reflect who the child is, but who the child has been taught to be. It is a symptom of the emotional landscape created by the adult they follow most closely. But with the presence of a grounded, emotionally mature adult who teaches clarity instead of silence, accountability instead of guilt, and integrity instead of secrecy, a child's moral compass can be realigned. Values are not fixed, they are learned. And children, when guided with patience and honesty, can learn to choose truth even after walking through the shadows of deception. Silence protects the wrong people, and this reality becomes evident when the weight of what is unspoken slowly builds in a household, a relationship, or within one's own mind. Silence is often mistaken for peace, for patience, for the wisdom of waiting until a situation resolves itself. Yet in truth, silence is rarely neutral. Every time an uncomfortable truth is avoided, every time a question is left unasked, every time a concern is dismissed for the sake of temporary calm, the space created by that silence becomes fertile ground for manipulation, control, and emotional harm. Silence, left unchecked, does not serve the vulnerable. It serves the person whose actions are being concealed. It protects the wrong people, often at the expense of those who have the right to knowledge, clarity, and emotional safety. In the story where the husband checks into a hotel with another woman using the wife's name, and the son is involved, the silence leading up to that moment was as consequential as the visible betrayal itself. Consider the way silence operates in daily life. Small things that could have been addressed are ignored, minor questions are left unanswered, and minor misgivings are buried under polite conversation. Each act of avoidance seems inconsequential at the time. No one sets out to let manipulation grow. People simply hope that the discomfort will dissipate if left alone. And for a while it may seem to work. Life goes on. Relationships appear intact. Smiles and routines are maintained. But underneath the surface, the unchecked silence is not neutral. It becomes a shield for deception, a mask that conceals the imbalance of power, and a slow-motion enabler of betrayal. The power of silence lies in its subtlety. When a truth is avoided, the person hiding it can continue to act without challenge. Their decisions go unchecked. Their boundaries expand without interference. And the person who remains silent, often out of fear, confusion, or hope, gradually becomes complicit, not necessarily because they are willing, but because silence has no capacity to correct or constrain behavior. Over time, the accumulation of these silences magnifies the harm. One unasked question turns into 100 unspoken observations. one avoided confrontation becomes a series of missed opportunities to assert one's rights, values, and expectations. In relationships where one person wields secrecy like a shield, silence is the soil in which manipulation takes root, allowing patterns of abuse, betrayal, or ethical compromise to take hold long before anyone is aware of the damage. In families, the consequences of silence are particularly acute. Children learn not only from what is said but also from what is not said. When parents avoid addressing uncomfortable truths, children internalize the message that silence is safer than honesty. They learn that questioning or confronting authority is dangerous. They learn that withholding concerns is the path of least resistance. They learn to protect the feelings or convenience of the adult at the expense of their own moral clarity. In the story, the son's participation in the father's plan reflects the effects of this dynamic. He did not step forward, question, or refuse, not because he was naturally dishonest, but because the environment around him had trained him to avoid the discomfort that truth brings. His silence, in obedience or in fear, facilitated the continuation of wrongdoing, and in that moment, silence became a powerful tool, not for justice, but for the protection of the person committing the harm. Silence also functions as a barrier to self-awareness. Avoiding uncomfortable truths allows cognitive dissonance to grow. When people refuse to acknowledge what they suspect or what they know deep down, their own perception of reality becomes distorted. Doubts that might have prompted action are rationalized, minimized, or buried. Emotions such as anger, fear, or disappointment fester beneath the surface, often transforming into resentment or numbness. In the story, had the wife allowed silence to dominate her perception indefinitely, she would have internalized confusion and pain, possibly blaming herself or questioning her judgment. Silence, in this sense, does not only protect the wrongdoer externally, it protects them by delaying accountability and by creating an internal environment in which their actions remain unchecked, unchallenged, and uncorrected. One of the most important lessons embedded in this keynote is the distinction between silence used for reflection and silence used for avoidance. Silence for reflection is a pause, an opportunity to consider one's options, gather information, and respond wisely. It is active, conscious, and temporary. Silence for avoidance, by contrast, is passive, reactive, and often motivated by fear of conflict or discomfort. It is the type of silence that enables manipulation, allows deception to continue, and signals, without words, that one's boundaries or values may be negotiable. Recognizing this distinction is essential for emotional self-protection. Choosing when to remain silent and when to speak is not a trivial skill. It is a cornerstone of maintaining integrity, protecting relationships, and defending one's emotional well-being. The act of speaking up, in contrast to silence, is a form of empowerment. It is a declaration that one's perception, feelings, and values matter. When a person seeks clarity, asks questions, or establishes boundaries, they remove the protective shield from the person who would manipulate or deceive. Speaking up introduces accountability where previously there was none. It challenges assumptions and forces the hidden truth into the light. It interrupts patterns of secrecy and opens the possibility for healthier communication and ethical alignment. In the story, had the wife confronted the signs of dishonesty early, asked questions about behaviors that seemed suspicious, and clarified her expectations for honesty, the dynamic that allowed the father to act covertly might have been altered. Silence, however, had allowed the manipulative behavior to continue undisturbed. Setting boundaries is a companion to speaking up. Boundaries are a physical and emotional framework that communicates what is acceptable and what is not. When a person maintains silence in the face of ethical or emotional violation, they effectively surrender their boundaries. They allow the other person to define the limits of the relationship, often unconsciously. In families and partnerships, this is particularly dangerous because it communicates to the child and the other adult that manipulation, dishonesty, or coercion will go unchallenged. Boundaries, when clearly defined, create a protective buffer. They demonstrate that one's values are non-negotiable. And they communicate that while relationships may require compromise, they do not require complicity in wrongdoing. The story demonstrates this principle vividly through the mother's response. Rather than allowing silence to dominate, she engaged with the situation actively, emotionally, and intellectually. She refused to internalize confusion or fear. She addressed the son directly, teaching him responsibility and the consequences of complicity. She reframed the environment by reasserting clarity, integrity, and accountability. Her actions show how speaking up and establishing boundaries are not acts of confrontation for the sake of conflict, but acts of self-preservation and moral education. By breaking the silence, she disrupted the protective shield around wrongdoing and offered an alternative model of ethical engagement for her child. Silence also functions as a mechanism of psychological inertia. Many people choose silence because confronting uncomfortable truths requires energy, courage, and foresight. It is emotionally taxing to demand honesty from someone who has not offered it voluntarily. It is socially risky to challenge a dominant family member. It is painful to assert one's perspective when it may provoke resistance, anger, or disappointment. And so silence becomes the path of least resistance. The problem is that inertia works in favor of the person who relies on secrecy. The longer silence persists, the more entrenched the patterns of manipulation become. The consequences grow heavier, and the eventual revelation of truth becomes far more destabilizing than if it had been addressed earlier. Avoiding uncomfortable truths also has a cumulative effect over time. Each unspoken concern, each ignored suspicion, each dismissed intuition adds another layer to the deception. By the time the truth emerges, as dramatically as a hotel booking under a spouse's name, the damage is not limited to the single incident. It encompasses months or years of unchallenged behaviors, subtle manipulations, and eroded trust. Silence does not merely protect the immediate wrongdoer, it safeguards the entire infrastructure of deception, allowing patterns to solidify and making the eventual consequences more severe. In educational terms, silence teaches lessons to everyone involved. It teaches the wrong person that deception works. It teaches observers, such as children, that avoidance is safer than confrontation, and it teaches the person who remains silent that self-protection can sometimes be postponed indefinitely. None of these lessons are beneficial. Only when uncomfortable truths are addressed does learning shift toward ethical responsibility, accountability, and emotional intelligence. Emotional self-protection is the antidote to the corrosive effects of silence. By speaking up, setting boundaries, and seeking clarity, individuals assert control over their own emotional space. They prevent manipulation from gaining power and reduce the risk of being drawn into patterns of complicity or enabling. This process is not always easy. It often involves risk, discomfort, and confrontation. But the alternative, remaining silent, is far more dangerous. Silence ensures that the wrong person benefits, that manipulation is rewarded, and that ethical decay continues unchecked. The story illustrates this principle beautifully through the mother's measured response. She does not react impulsively or with anger, she acts with intention. She identifies the source of wrongdoing, addresses it calmly, and restores a framework of integrity. Her silence would have protected the wrongdoer, her husband, but by refusing to remain silent, she safeguarded her child, her dignity, and her own emotional clarity. Speaking up becomes an act of courage, yes, but also an act of education. It shows the child what accountability looks like, what moral responsibility entails, and how one can resist being drawn into another person's unethical actions. Ultimately, silence is a choice. Every time a person chooses not to speak, to ignore suspicion, or to avoid conflict, they are choosing whom to protect. Silence is never neutral. It protects those who act deceptively or unethically, often at the cost of those who deserve honesty and clarity. Emotional self-protection, the practice of speaking up, seeking clarity, and setting boundaries, is a conscious, active resistance against this pattern. It is a refusal to allow manipulation to persist unchecked. It is a commitment to integrity over convenience, clarity over confusion, and accountability over passivity. When examined closely, the story demonstrates that silence is far more dangerous than the act it seeks to conceal. It is the enabler of betrayal, the teacher of complicity, and the invisible hand that shields wrongdoing from challenge. And when someone finally chooses to break the silence, to speak, to assert boundaries, and to demand truth, they do not merely respond to a single act. They begin dismantling an entire system of protection that has allowed manipulation to thrive. The moment they speak is the moment they reclaim ethical authority, emotional clarity, and personal dignity. In conclusion, silence protects the wrong people because it allows deception to continue. It shields manipulation from scrutiny. It teaches observers, particularly children, that avoidance is safer than confrontation, and it erodes the emotional and ethical structure of relationships. Speaking up, seeking clarity, and setting boundaries are acts of courage, wisdom, and self-protection. They prevent the wrong person from benefiting at your expense. They restore accountability, nurture ethical awareness, and create an environment in which trust, integrity, and clarity can grow. Silence may feel safe in the moment, but over time, it becomes corrosive. Only through active engagement with truth can one protect oneself, guide others, and ensure that wrong actions do not continue unchallenged. Self-worth comes from standing with your integrity, not against someone else's betrayal, and this realization often emerges in the most unexpected and painful moments of life. Many people spend years defining themselves in opposition to the actions of others, measuring their worth, their feelings, and their choices according to the wrongs committed against them. They become consumed with seeking explanations, demanding apologies, or proving that they are the innocent party. Yet in doing so, they allow their sense of self to be shaped entirely by the behavior of someone else. Often someone who has chosen deception, betrayal, or disregard. True dignity is never borrowed from another person's conscience or morality. It is cultivated internally, through intentional choices to align one's actions, thoughts, and emotions with one's own values. In the story where the husband checked into a hotel using the wife's name and involved their son in the deception, the protagonist's path to self-worth was neither immediate nor easy. Initially, as is natural, the immediate reaction was a mix of shock, confusion, anger, and heartbreak. These emotions are not weaknesses, they are human responses to violations of trust and personal boundaries. The protagonist may have sought explanations, replayed the events in her mind, questioned what she could have done differently, or tried to rationalize the actions of the person who had betrayed her. Many people fall into this pattern because it is instinctual to seek understanding when something incomprehensible occurs. Yet she realized, through reflection, emotional awareness, and a commitment to personal growth, that explanations, while humanly desirable, were not necessary for reclaiming her dignity. The pursuit of explanations can be seductive because it gives a temporary sense of control. If one can understand the motivations behind betrayal, it feels as if one can also predict, prevent, or fix the situation. However, this search often traps people in a cycle of emotional dependency on the very person who has violated them. Every unanswered question, every evasive statement, and every denial prolongs suffering, reinforcing the idea that self-worth is contingent on another person's acknowledgement, honesty, or behavior. The moment the protagonist stopped chasing explanations, she took the first true step toward reclaiming her self-respect. By refusing to anchor her value in someone else's choices, she broke free from the emotional orbit of betrayal. Standing with integrity means aligning your actions and decisions with your principles, regardless of how others behave. It is an internal compass that guides conduct when external circumstances are chaotic or unjust. Integrity is not determined by loyalty to another person's behavior, it is determined by loyalty to oneself. In the story, the protagonist exercised integrity by refusing to participate in manipulation, refusing to compromise her values to appease the betrayer, and refusing to allow the betrayal to define her emotional identity. She did not retaliate or act out of vengeance. She did not allow her emotions to dictate unethical or impulsive behavior. Instead, she acted consistently with her sense of right and wrong, demonstrating that dignity is maintained when one stands firm in personal values, even in the absence of fairness or acknowledgement from others. Self-worth is reinforced when emotional clarity replaces confusion, resentment, or obsession. Emotional clarity is the ability to understand one's feelings without being overwhelmed by them. It is the skill of observing emotional reactions, distinguishing between justified responses and impulsive desires, and choosing a course of action based on values rather than raw emotion. The protagonist's path demonstrates this principle. Initially, it would have been natural for her to feel hurt, betrayed, and vengeful. These feelings were real and valid, yet she chose not to allow them to dominate her decisions or her identity. She reflected on her emotions, recognized them, and allowed herself to respond in a way that preserved her integrity. Emotional clarity is not cold detachment, it is conscious engagement with reality, choosing actions that reinforce self-respect rather than prolong suffering. Personal direction is the third pillar in this process. Once emotional clarity is achieved, the next step is to reclaim one's path in life independently of another person's wrongdoing. Personal direction involves making choices about one's career, relationships, daily routines, and emotional boundaries, based on personal goals and values, not as reactions to betrayal. In the story, the protagonist demonstrated personal direction by redirecting her energy toward rebuilding her life on her own terms. She recognized that her identity and worth are not contingent on the loyalty, honesty, or recognition of the person who had betrayed her. This shift, from reactive existence to proactive self-determination, is critical. It transforms the experience of betrayal from one of victimhood to one of empowerment. A critical aspect of standing with integrity is understanding that dignity does not require the approval of those who violate your trust. Often, people believe that self-respect is validated when the wrongdoer expresses remorse, apologizes, or changes behavior. While apologies can facilitate reconciliation, they are not prerequisites for personal worth. True dignity is maintained independently of the other person's actions. It is rooted in the conscious choice to live according to one's values, to establish boundaries, and to refuse participation in cycles of manipulation, dishonesty, or emotional harm. In the story, the protagonist maintained her self-respect not because of external validation, but because she actively chose not to compromise her principles despite the betrayal. The process of reclaiming self-worth after betrayal is gradual. It involves introspection, reflection, and often repeated practice of integrity in challenging circumstances. Every time the protagonist refused to chase explanations, she strengthened her internal sense of autonomy. Every time she responded with calm and clarity rather than impulsive retaliation, she reinforced her dignity. Every time she set boundaries with the betrayer or clarified expectations for herself and her child, she demonstrated that her self-respect is non-negotiable. These small, consistent acts accumulate over time, creating a foundation of self-worth that cannot be undermined by external deception or injustice. In the story, the mother also recognized that teaching her child about integrity was intertwined with her own reclamation of dignity. She understood that demonstrating self-respect through her actions provided a model for her son. Children learn about values not only through explicit instruction, but also by observing how adults handle adversity. By standing firm in her principles, refusing to chase explanations, and redirecting her life with clarity and purpose, she provided an example of ethical strength and emotional resilience. This further reinforced her own sense of worth, as her actions had both immediate and generational impact. Another aspect of reclaiming self-worth is accepting reality as it is, rather than as one wishes it to be. Betrayal often creates a cognitive dissonance, a struggle between the reality of someone's actions and the way we wish they had behaved. Attempting to reconcile this dissonance by chasing explanations, demanding apologies, or trying to control outcomes creates dependency on someone who may be unwilling or unable to meet those expectations. By accepting reality without justification or rationalization, the protagonist freed herself from emotional imprisonment. She acknowledged the betrayal, understood that she did not cause it, and recognized that her integrity remained intact regardless of another person's choices. Acceptance does not mean approval. It means understanding the boundaries of one's control and choosing to act in alignment with personal values despite the circumstances. Self-worth is also reinforced by establishing boundaries. Boundaries are a tangible expression of integrity, signaling to oneself and others what is acceptable and what is not. They protect emotional space, prevent further exploitation, and reinforce autonomy. In the story, the protagonist's boundaries were clear. She would not participate in deception, she would not allow her identity to be misused, and she would guide her child with principles rooted in honesty and responsibility. These boundaries serve as both shield and compass, preserving self-respect while guiding action. Boundaries also communicate to others, including children, that integrity is actionable, measurable, and non-negotiable. The culmination of these principles, emotional clarity, personal direction, and boundaries, leads to empowerment. Standing with integrity transforms betrayal from an event that diminishes self-worth into a catalyst for self-realization. It allows the protagonist to reclaim agency over her life, redefine her values on her own terms, and demonstrate that dignity is not contingent on the ethical behavior of others. In essence, her worth is internalized, self-generated, and independent. This internalization is critical because external circumstances are unpredictable, and relying on them for validation makes one vulnerable to ongoing manipulation and emotional harm. The story also demonstrates the long-term value of internalized self-worth. By maintaining her integrity, the protagonist creates a stable foundation for all future relationships and decisions. She establishes a personal standard for trust, honesty, and accountability that guides not only her interactions with others, but also her own choices. This internal standard becomes a form of resilience, enabling her to navigate future challenges without losing sight of her values. Her integrity acts as a compass, her clarity as a lens, and her personal direction as a roadmap, ensuring that her self-worth remains intact regardless of external betrayal or adversity. Moreover, standing with integrity after betrayal fosters a deeper understanding of human behavior. The protagonist learns that people act according to their own values, capabilities, and choices, not according to what we deserve or hope for. This understanding reduces the tendency to internalize blame or to overextend emotional energy toward justifying or explaining another person's misconduct. It reinforces the lesson that self-worth is not conditional on someone else's morality or recognition. By focusing inward, aligning with her values, and acting consistently with integrity, she fortifies herself against the unpredictability of human behavior and secures a sense of dignity that is unshakable. Another vital element is the separation of identity from the actions of others. Betrayal often triggers a distorted sense of self, causing individuals to question their worth, judgment, and desirability. Standing with integrity helps disentangle personal identity from the immoral or unethical behavior of another. The protagonist's identity remains intact. Her worth is not diminished by the misuse of her name, her trust, or her emotions. By anchoring her self-concept in her principles rather than the betrayals committed against her, she establishes a form of self-worth that is resilient, sustainable, and independent. In addition, reclaiming self-worth after betrayal encourages proactive life design. Instead of remaining reactive to past harms or attempting to repair someone else's ethical failings, the protagonist can redirect energy toward meaningful goals, personal growth, and the cultivation of healthy relationships. This forward momentum reinforces dignity, demonstrating that true self-respect is manifested not only in restraint or reflection, but also in constructive action. By building a life aligned with values rather than shaped by betrayal, she embodies the principle that integrity is both a protective and generative force. Ultimately, self-worth comes from standing with integrity because it anchors identity in principles, not in someone else's behavior. It allows a person to navigate betrayal without losing themselves, to maintain dignity in the face of injustice, and to reclaim agency over emotional and practical decisions. By refusing to chase explanations, seeking clarity for oneself rather than for the betrayer, and choosing a path defined by personal values, the protagonist demonstrates that self-respect is self-generated. It is preserved internally, reinforced by consistent ethical action, and expressed through emotional clarity and personal direction. Through her journey, the protagonist teaches a profound lesson. Dignity is not restored by changing the actions of others. It is restored by realigning with one's own values. Integrity is not a reaction to betrayal. It is a steadfast orientation toward truth, ethical action, and self-respect. Emotional clarity, personal direction, and principled boundaries are the tools by which this alignment is achieved. When a person stands with integrity, betrayal no longer dictates their identity, worth, or future. Instead, they reclaim the authority to live a life consistent with their values, independent of external harm, and fortified against the unpredictability of others. In conclusion, the path to self-worth after betrayal is neither quick nor easy. It requires reflection, discipline, courage, and an unwavering commitment to personal values. It involves refusing to chase explanations that serve only to prolong dependency, cultivating emotional clarity that guides action over reaction, setting boundaries that protect dignity, and asserting personal direction that shapes life proactively. Standing with integrity transforms betrayal from an event that diminishes the self into an opportunity to reinforce self-respect, cultivate resilience, and model ethical strength for others. Self-worth, therefore, is not given, earned, or negotiated through the behavior of those who betray us. It is claimed, maintained, and nurtured by aligning consistently with one's own principles and refusing to let external wrongdoing define one's internal value.